And this is the historian's moment, and I'm pleased to be joined by Nell Irvin Painter of Princeton. She is also, true to her name, a painter, an artist, and you should look at it. It's good. David Greenberg of Rutgers, American historian. Ruth Ben-Ghiat of NYU, a global historian and author of Strong Men. You've seen Ruth, I'm sure, on MSNBC a lot lately. Welcome, everybody. So let's start with a broad historical view. What kind of moment are we in? Are we in a moment that's remotely like, say, 1859 in this country?
Yes.
Okay. You want to say a little more?
Yes, this is very much like 1859. 1859, just before, of course, the Civil War. And actually, for you, in December, I wrote in the New Republic that I've been hearing people worrying about Civil War. And I said, yeah, I worry about Civil War too, but we had one once. It killed a lot of people, but it got rid of slavery. It gave us the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, and it was probably the only way we could have gotten rid of slavery.
So what does that mean today? I mean, we're not going to have a war between the states. The geography doesn't work out that way. So what does it look like?
To me, things are very scary now, but they're not the scariest ever in American history.
David, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I'm glad we made that distinction between real civil war and maybe something more than purely metaphorical civil war, but the kind of intense political conflict we're having. With the stipulation that we are all dreadfully worried about the prospect of Trump's return to power, and I think it's fair to say we all see Trump as someone who has no regard for the normal constraints that democracy or even the Constitution and the law impose. All that said, I have throughout the last several years put myself on the somewhat less alarmist end of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. I think historical analogies are useful, and I write about them, but I think they can also mislead. And I think the Civil War talk isn't quite the right metaphor or the right set of questions to reach for. What I see more is a kind of potential for a slow degradation of democracy, of respect for law, and other people have articulated this in books and essays about sort of the norms and institutions that have made this democracy not only strong but also capable of correction and improvement. And I remember saying in 2016-17, I think we can survive one Trump term, but not two. Yeah. I hadn't thought about one and then one without and then one with again. So yeah. I'm a little unsure sort of what the prospects are.
Let me flip it, and let's assume Trump doesn't win, and Trump's America is livid, and they believe the 2024 election was stolen, and they believe America is going Marxist and everything like that. There are, right now, a lot of secessionist movements in the United States. It's not states that are seceding from the federal government, but there are movements within states to secede. Isn't that possible that will happen? Those kinds of things might start happening?
Oh, I think it's very possible we will see secessionist movements. We will see violent outbreaks.
We already have.
Right.
We already have.
Right, and so that some will turn violent.
We already have.
Right. Would it result in a fracturing of the United States? This is the hard thing. Historians, we do the past, not the future. I find it hard to foresee, but just last weekend with the massacres in Israel, that was very hard. Despite people warning of things like that, and that this is what Hamas was all about, we didn't see it coming. So I hate to be complacent. I hate to see, don't worry, Mike, it's not going to happen. Yeah, there'll be some people who are unhappy, but we'll be okay. That's what I want to say, but, I'm not ready to put my chips there.
Yeah. Ruth, you're a global historian, so situate this moment and that movement, the MAGA movement, in global history.
Yeah, so as everyone was saying, it's very difficult to figure out what form the assault on democracy when it starts, like the takeover, will look like. But what we know is that we're in the middle of a very formidable engineered degradation of democracy. And in that sense, are we like Germany in 1932? We're also like Chile in 1972, because to have the coup in 1973, there was 3 years in Chile of discrediting, undermining. It was like a strategy of tension with low-level violence, with right-wing mothers mobilizing to discredit, at the time it was Allende, and also discredit democracy and build an appetite for authoritarian rule, which in that case was a coup. Because we think of coups, which are a third of my book, which I had no idea there'd be a coup here, right? Yeah. But it was very useful knowledge to have. We think of them as quick, but they require planning and the right climate to be accepted after it happens. So the main thing I'm really concerned about with MAGA, which I see as a kind of right-wing counter-revolution in the fascist tradition also, is that Trump has been re-educating Americans since 2015, using his rallies, using his events, to see violence differently, to see violence in a positive light. He is a superb propagandist. He's one of the most important propagandists of the 21st century. And people laugh when I say that, but it's true. And the emotional retraining to consider violence as necessary and patriotic, that's why he went to Waco. That's why he went to the gun store. So his campaign is a radicalization vehicle. And that's preparing whatever form it would take, right? Which we can't know that.
What are the constituent elements of fascism when it appears around the world? I remember when George W. Bush was president. Seems a little quaint now, but it seemed serious then. Something happened, and this paper circulated by some professor of the 14 elements of fascism. I don't know if you remember that. But what to you are the constituent elements of fascism?
So it's notoriously, nebulous, but there are traits, and Umberto Eco and others have got lists of them. Mussolini actually defined fascism in 1921, so right before the March on Rome, as a revolution of reaction. And that's a very good kind of container, let's say, because you have the desire to destabilize accepted authority. You have extremism that becomes mainstreamed. We're seeing that in our country. You have violence seen as the only way to change history and move things forward, which Matt Gaetz went to the Iowa State Fair recently to support Trump, and people are eating their corn dogs, they've got their toddlers with them, and Matt Gaetz says, only through force will we bring change to corrupt DC. I read that as him saying, excuse me, elections won't work, democratic reform doesn't work, it's violence. So that's part of it. Then you have hyper-nationalism, you have xenophobia, you have the targeting of enemies who can be internal enemies or external. And so Trumpism and its allied movements, including the faith traditions of evangelicals, they're all hitting notes that go back to the original fascist years.
Yes, David,
Can I just jump in? I think the question of fascism as a word is a difficult one. I mean, there have been these sort of taxonomies and lists, Robert Paxton and others, and Ruth has laid out some of the key qualities. I think it's better that we talk about these elements, like the use of extra-legal political violence, than to fixate on the word itself, because as people know, Nixon was called a fascist. He certainly had authoritarian tendencies and tried to set up a secret police in the White House. Reagan, Bush, the term has been sort of degraded as a political slogan and epithet, so that kind of crying wolf phenomenon. So when we see someone like Trump, we can get into debate, is he a fascist, is he not? What's more important is we focus on these elements in his political repertoire, the hyper-nationalism, the encouragement of violence, and so on.
No?
And plus, we don't have to use the word fascist, which has kind of European aura around it. But when you talk extra-legal violence, the Klan, lynching, we have plenty in our own history that has American words that will go with what we're seeing. So hyper-nationalism is white supremacy.
Now, let me stick with you, and we'll work down the row with this question. I want to ask about this question of two Americas. In our current issue, our November issue of the New Republic, we have an excerpt of Heather Cox Richardson's new book. And our excerpt is about, and the book is largely about, this long, long history of these two different conceptions of the United States, these two different conceptions of democracy, these two different ideals, and the two different coalitions or tribes that have formed around those ideals in this country. We feel like we've been polarized since the 90s, since the Gingrich era, but
We've been polarized forever.
So please talk about this.
I've just been working on Sojourner Truth, who was a New Yorker, and the whole question around slavery and anti-slavery. And actually, to get back to your last year, what do we see in 2050, which is like 30 years from now? And I thought back into the 19th century. So if we were back in, say, 1859 or 1860, go back 30 years, and the anti-slavery movement was really tiny, but it made such a difference in those 30 years. So in the 19th century, abolitionists were just a small part of the American policy and American thinking and culture. So, and then there was a whole lot more. There was the Democrats in the South who were holding on to slavery at the cost of the Union. There were the capitalists, and there were the socialists. So it was more than two Americas. But I will end what I'm saying now by saying that let's just say there were two Americas. And for most of my very long life, I have felt like an outcast in the sense of not seeing the country the way it's reflected back to me in books and the newspapers and so forth. I felt like I was living in a different country. But after 2020 and the George Floyd uprising and what somebody has called the Great White Awakening, I have felt more like I am in my country.
David, Heather writes, to oversimplify just a little bit, that there's a conception of America that's rooted in race and blood and religion, and there's another conception of America rooted in rights and emancipation and perfection of the Union in the sense that we all here understand it. Does all that seem about right to you, or how would you put it?
I think these can be useful heuristics for starting to analyze our politics and why different demographic groups vote and behave the way they do. But I think there's a risk in sort of committing too much to this binary dichotomy, if you will. The reason that Joe Biden won and Hillary Clinton lost is because a lot of people in between changed their minds about Trump, about the Democratic Party, about a variety of things. Even if you look in 2016, if the election had been held in mid-October, it's almost certain Hillary Clinton would have won. Just the polls were overwhelming. And then, it started to narrow. Events happen. People do change their minds, and we are polarized and tribal. I won't say seemingly as never before, because we've talked about 1860, even in the 1960s, you could say. But politics depends on the affirmation that there's a capacity for movement among the polity, and that the two Americas framework, there are probably people, many people, who find some sympathy with both of these conceptions to greater or lesser degrees, or maybe who have a third altogether different conception of what the American tradition is. So without disparaging the real intellectual lineages that Heather has found, I think it can be a stifling as well as an illuminating framework for understanding our history and politics.
Ruth? Your thoughts on the two Americas, or on, were there two Italys in the 1920s?
I mean, it's really interesting that we're living through this drama of dysfunction of the bipartisan system. What happens to a bipartisan nation when one of the two parties exits democracy? The GOP has become an autocratic party. It's no longer interested in democratic norms, democratic procedures. That's why January 6th was the coup attempt. And there's nowhere else. This is the big drama, and there have been other panels on here, and we'll continue the conversation this afternoon. There's nowhere else for these people to go. And so when we look at times around the world where kind of strongman figures have been prevented from coming to power, sometimes it's like, to use an example, Italy, which has a multi-party system. In 2019, all the other parties, even though they didn't like each other, they banded together to prevent Matteo Salvini, an awful thug, basically, from becoming prime minister. But we can't do that. So we're like fossilized now. And this is, of course, the big narrative, the big drama is what happens. 2024 in the GOP is a race to the bottom, but we only have these two parties. And we also, I want to say a word about the necessity of bridge building, because we are stuck right now with these two parties. There's also, you'll correct me, what was the number of people who didn't vote in 2016, 2020? Was it like, there are tens of millions of people. Yep. So that's the third America. And how the two nations things leaves them out, right? And so I wish that we would hear more about the amazing and extensive efforts going on in America at bridge building. There are people who are doing things locally, there are people putting coalitions together nationally, Republican, Democrat. There's a whole world of bridge building stuff that is trying to unite these two Americas before it's too late. And here it's also about undoing this emotional re-education and conditioning that the right-wing media and Trump, et cetera, have been doing for 7 years now. So I think there are other stories to be told, and we need to be telling them, and especially in the next year coming into the election.
And just a quick comment on the dysfunction of the two-party system. I agree with everything you said, Ruth. It's important to remember, though, that for much of the 20th century, particularly from the 30s and 40s onward, our two-party system was heralded as a bulwark against communism and fascism, against totalitarianism, because one was forced to sort of come to the center and build coalitions within the party. And now we're seeing that, okay, maybe that wasn't quite as effective as we thought. But it has to do with historical contingencies, where we are right now, as well as the problem of the two-party system. I mean, I think I can very much envision a way in which a healthy two-party democracy is restored.
No?
Yes. Our parties have changed over the passage of time, of course. The Republican Party as we know it, in fact, in our lifetimes has changed. And if we go back decades, it changed. And if we go back centuries, it changed. Same for the Democratic Party. But one thing that has been true in American politics since the 19th century is the importance of race. Race is the way that so many Americans think about what the country means, who belongs. And I think even now there are lingering ideas that somehow black people ought not vote, or black people's voting is illegitimate. And I have a question in my mind. If large numbers of Americans can actually face up to the fact that the present Democratic Party is a multiracial, multi-ethnic party. You can see it whenever you see, in fact, look at the prosecutors after Trump right now, and they're black men and women. I know he knows that. But we have a multiracial, multi-ethnic party, and I don't hear or see large numbers of Americans embracing that part of our national life. But it came very starkly to me in 2020, and particularly in January 21, when the people who were assaulting the Capitol were overwhelmingly white, and the people who were inside were multicultural, and on the Democratic Party, very multiracial. Can we embrace that in a positive way?
Well, a lot of us are. And we're inside the 2-minute warning, so I'm going to ask one more question of all three of you, Ruth, David, and then Nell. Democracies disappear, not forever, but for a while. Ruth cited Chile. They lost their democracy for 20-something years before they got it back. How worried are you on a scale of 1 to 10 that we could lose our democracy, at least temporarily, for some period of time?
If Trump comes back to the White House, it's 8 or 9 out of 10. Sorry. Because he's got an army of people. He's got a coalition of 70 organizations working on the Project 2025, which, if you remember the shock, I call them shock events. Remember when he came in and he had the so-called Muslim travel ban, and it was implemented in a chaotic way? That would be times 100. And they're working on that assiduously. So that's what I feel.
David?
I am less worried. I wouldn't frame it as losing a democracy, but as weakening, and we use the word degrading, and harming democracy. So we become a less democratic, less liberal in the general sense nation, rather than, say, a dictatorship, which I still see as remote.
And no.
Well, thank you very much, and I agree with both of you. But I go back to the 19th century, in which Americans paraded themselves around as Democrats, and the United States, I'm talking about a country which embraced slavery, and none of the enslaved millions could even begin to vote. There was so much else they couldn't do. It was not a democracy. It became a democracy within our lifetimes, in the 1960s, at least a start. So on the one hand, I'm with Ruth being very frightened about what could happen, but the historian in me says, we've been here before.
Well, let's hope we get out of it. Nell Irvin Painter, David Greenberg, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, thank you so much.